Jefferson Airplane. He was like Zelig, he was everywhere at the right moment. He was in London for all that beat music, for the Beatles, for swinging London, and then he moved here just in time for the Summer of Love. I mean, he was just, you know, in '69, he was here with Quicksilver, Steve Miller, let's say Woodstock, the Jefferson Airplane, Volunteers. He just hit the ground running here too. There are people here who knew him in that era. I met him at the end of his life. So people here know much more about him than I do. You could say that in that time, steadily through the 70s, his problems with alcohol and drugs accelerated. And Al-Anon and all those things, they talk about rock bottom. There were a couple of instances that came through interviews which I could have described as rock bottom, but there was one particular one which I actually didn't really want to believe. It was a story that a couple of people told me. And until I met Greg Douglas, who played with Steve Miller and many other bands I'm sure you all know about, he told me he was a witness for this, and then I was able to believe it. And I think it possibly is a good description of what one might say was rock bottom. The longest I associated with Nicky was in the band Raven, which unfortunately was during the dark time of Nicky's life. Things were getting pretty ugly between him and Dolly, and apparently there was another guy living at the house that was Dolly's boyfriend. Nicky was drinking an enormous amount of tequila, and he would come to rehearsal, learn the songs, play them brilliantly, then the next night he would have completely forgotten and we'd have to relearn everything. It was frustrating. The other thing I remember from those sessions was Nicky's belt. Nicky would do these wonderful glissandos, but was drinking so much that he'd sometimes get to the end of the piano and keep going and fall off the stool. It was getting to the point where he was hurting himself. So we finally had to rig up a canvas belt to attach to the keyboard. Nicky was wearing a seatbelt during rehearsals. It was actually pretty funny because he'd be doing this wonderful run, then he'd jerk right back. So it worked beautifully. Nicky was very unhappy at that point in his life and very upset about the situation with Dolly, a lot of self-recrimination, a lot of shame, and John Cipollina, who was very close to him, felt helpless. Both musicians appeared on several Terry and the Pirates releases, though not necessarily having recorded at the same time, etc., etc. So that's the seatbelt. Now, that was one incident which I thought kind of described rock bottom.